This is Judaism Unbound, episode 543, Tisha B'av 2026. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofeberg.
And I'm Rena Yehuda Newman.
And today we are bringing you a conversation about Tisha B'av, the 9th of Av. We're exploring an observance that for some is a really integral part of their calendar year, for others is something they struggle with or don't participate in at all, and for still others is a little bit of both. And so we are spending 2 weeks discussing this observance. Once, just the two of us, that's today, and another time we will be with two guests. And so we're looking forward to that, which maybe is kind of funny because the 9th of Av is not necessarily a day that people look forward to. But I do think it's a moment where we can check in sort of about the purpose of this holiday and more broadly about the purpose of how we relate to the Jewish calendar more broadly. Before we start, a couple quick shout outs. We have a graduation ceremony coming up for the students finishing the certificate program in Unbound Judaism that Rena Yehuda directs.
Woohoo!
That's coming up in a few weeks on August 2nd. That's a Sunday, August 2nd at 1 p.m. Eastern. And we really hope that you'll be there. There's a Zoom gathering for the graduates to be at, for other certificate programs, for our entire community to celebrate them and receive their Torah. So that's going to be really, really amazing. And it's coming up fairly soon. So head to judaismunbound.com/certificate, where you can learn more about the program generally. Applications are unfortunately no longer open, but you can learn what people have created as their capstones, and you can sign up to attend this graduation. So that's an important shout. But let's get into the conversation. The 9th of Av, it's often called the fast of the 9th of Av for a variety of reasons we've talked about in the past. I don't know that calling it quote unquote a fast day is necessarily what I would want to do with the 9th of Av. But it is a day that is marked by mourning, all sorts of tragedies in the Jewish past, specifically and especially the destructions of the first and second temple in Jerusalem. So there's a lot of layers. And increasing layers have been added over the years where later Jewish tragedies, including up to the present day and including the Holocaust, have in certain senses been mapped onto the day, depending on who you're observing with and how. But it brings up a lot of issues. And so, Rena Yehuda, I'd love to hear from you. Where might we start in a conversation about the 9th of Av, unbinding it, revisioning it through a Judaism Unbound lens?
You know, as you were talking about it being a fast day, I was thinking, usually my experience of Tisha B'av is that it's quite slow.
Oh, gosh. Woo, good one.
You know, and it's like I say that both as a pun, but in a real way, my experience of Tisha B'av is slow. It's a day of mourning. We've discussed about these questions for the observance of Yom Kippur, right? Like how other people are observing the high holidays, how people are talking about teshuvah, which is often translated as repentance, repair, return, and saying that for some people, fasting actually doesn't accomplish that end. When we're thinking about fast days or major fast days on the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur and Tisha B'av are really like, these are the two really, really big ones. And it's amazing because these 2 days could not be more different from each other. Yom Kippur is not a sad day. In many ways, it's actually quite a joyful day, but it's serious. But it's not about grief and mourning. That's not the central thesis here. But Tisha B'av is. And so I think when we're talking about what does it mean to really unbind these practices, a lot of the approach to unbinding a holiday is about understanding what is the core desire or yearning or purpose of the day, and what are we doing to actually accomplish that? Are the practices that we've received or inherited actually helping us get there? And so I think there's the one obvious strand about it, which is like, does fasting actually help us accomplish grief? I'm thinking now of a really innovative document that was created that actually I think really describes the ways that fasting might in fact be a relevant and useful practice. Halachic Left a few years ago put together this incredible document that went through Eicha, that went through Lamentations, and verse by verse cited different news articles about the destruction of Gaza. And it was this really, really relevant, really, really live experience of all of the suffering and destruction that is happening in the world today in a way that felt directly relevant to Tisha B'av and really brought up the question of what does it mean to fast when there are people who are being starved? But I think that there's this other application, or there's another opportunity to really think about unbound practice for Tisha B'av, Tisha B'av isn't actually just commemorating the destruction of one temple. It's not even just commemorating the destruction of two temples. It's commemorating the destruction of both temples and the Holocaust and the Spanish Inquisition and. It's all of these different tragedies rolled into one. And so it makes me wonder about what kinds of possibilities for observance or for grief and mourning practices are also coming along with this idea that we're actually collapsing time, that we're taking all of these different instances and we're rolling them into one observance, or what other ways we can do that kind of collapsing of time or time travel in order to have an effect that is about this kind of commemoration.
Yeah, a lot of good layers there. The Yom Kippur Tisha B'av thing, I do want to say, this comes up a lot, especially people like us who work in Jewish life, who think a lot about the different valences of different holidays. I think we say, like, Yom Kippur and Tisha B'av are super different. Like, Yom Kippur is this day where the gates are open and we're like being able to rid ourselves of sins. And yes, we fast, but there's a lot of happiness associated with it. Like, absolutely. And the 9th of Av, we're sitting on the floor. We're reading really sad texts. It seems that they should obviously be different. And I think a lot of people experience them as very similar. I think we have to be honest that if the intention is that the 9th of Av and Yom Kippur will be perceived by people as super different, and they're not observing them in like a super classic kind of in a synagogue or in a communal Jewish space setting, if all they're doing or most of what they're doing for both days is like they're not eating, they're going to feel pretty similar to one another. And so the question becomes what you already were bringing up. Should the essence be the not eating? I don't think that it should. I'm somebody who fasts, and I've talked about that before. Like I get meaning out of that, and it helps me in both of those days sort of attune myself to whatever my focus is for the day. But if we really want this like diametrically different energy, then one or both of those holidays needs some work in my view, because I think they do get pushed together. When you talk about like what are the different kinds of holidays or observances in the calendar year, often people will say, and there's these fast days, quote unquote major fast days are Yom Kippur and the 9th of Av, though that's a category. And then there are these minor fast days that there's a bunch of other fast days that are called minor because the fast is from sun up to sundown instead of being a full 24 or 25 hour fast, which the 9th of Av and Yom Kippur are. That's not so much a solution as a diagnosis. I don't think you're wrong. There are differences to these days. And sometimes there's this tendency among folks who really are deep in the liturgy and the text to lose that, like, for a lot of folks, it's just kind of a general vibe for the day. And if you're fasting on both, like Yom Kippur doesn't feel like a happy day to people. Like, I think this may be more of a Yom Kippur thing for a few months, because like when I tell people Yom Kippur is a happy day, a lot of folks are surprised. And then if you're being by the book, it's like, well, they're surprised because they don't know the inner character of the holiday. But I think that the people's instincts and experiences of what a day is are often right. And our tradition is failing at achieving what it wants to. I think Yom Kippur, calling it a happy day, I think if you say that to most folks, like the break fast is happy. Happy people running around with whatever like foods because they're done with the part that wasn't happy. So I don't know what to do with that, but I want to throw in that I think Yom Kippur and the 9th of Av, if we really want to distinguish them, we can't just take for granted that they are because of history. The other thing is what you talked about with all these different moments of tragedy being centered in one day. That is what I love about the 9th of Av. I do actually mourn the destruction of the first temple and the second temple. Some people, they don't think about that, or they don't think we should think about that. That is part of it for me. And the strength of the 9th of Av in the calendar year, in my view, is that it centers a huge amount of communal loss and destruction and tragedy in one day. You mentioned the Holocaust. There are some who would hear you say that and say, no, the Holocaust has its own day. Not only one, it has two, because it has Yom HaShoah, which is on whether we call it a Jewish calendar or the Israeli calendar, that's a whole other conversation, but it is on the contemporary calendar. And you have sort of the secular Holocaust Remembrance Day that are separate from the 9th of Av. In my dream world, I would center that and all of our other tragedies, not to say they're unimportant and don't merit mourning. I would center them in the 9th of Av, because I think we are served better as a people when we have one day where we really focus on that side of our history, on our deep destruction. I don't think we're somehow diminishing different destructions and tragedies by having them all be on one day. If anything, we're elevating them. And so I would prefer that. We currently live in a Jewish calendar where we actually have a lot of other days that also hold that.
Well, and I think what you just said, that it's really crucial, actually, that by collapsing these different events into one day, it's a deepening. I think about, the consumer culture that we largely exist in the West, TM, and the ways that it means that we don't ever have opportunities to stop and have grief. That, grief isn't good for selling things. And there's something so powerful about having Tisha B'av as an opportunity to actually have an experience of grief, but not just in singular experience of grief, as we so often experience it with individual loss, but of collective grief. That there's an understanding that it's not I lost something, it's we lost something. We lost something and we are losing something. There are contemporary tragedies that are happening, contemporary tragedies that we are attached to. And to have that be something that's actually foregrounded or backgrounded with the history of various tragedies that we've always spent this day gathered together crying or reading documents about those destructions and that heartache, it's a really, really powerful practice and a really, really important opportunity, because we avoid grief at all costs, I think, culturally. When the emphasis just becomes on fasting, we lose some of that. But also, I grew up in the Reform movement, and in the Reform movement, I was not actually taught to observe Tisha B'av, which is really interesting considering the most Jewish involvement I was having was over the summer. I would be at summer camp, and I didn't learn about Tisha B'av, even though Tisha B'av would be happening at the time that I was immersed in a Jewish community. And it wasn't until after I had gotten older and I had learned that there was this other holiday that happens during the summer that I started observing it. And then I actually found myself at great odds with the rest of the summer camp. I remember we were going on this big field trip that was on a really hot day to a really big park. And I was fasting. And I was actually as a counselor, I couldn't be a responsible adult for the children who were entrusted in my care because my Jewish practice was actually at odds with what the rest of the Jewish community was doing. And it really led me to ask this question: why is there a whole subsection of the Jewish community that isn't observing Tisha B'av? Is it because actually maybe Yom HaShoah has taken the place of that? And there are all kinds of political implications of that potentially. I'm not sure. But I experienced a sense of loss at the loss of that holiday. Because what does it mean when we don't have grief?
So we can talk a little about the history there, and I think we're going to even more next week. And I mean, you in the Reform movement, and I also grew up in the Reform movement. I did actually grow up, it's complicated. I grew up in a Reform synagogue, but I went to a summer camp that was a JCC summer camp and understood itself as kind of pluralistic. And so in that setting, the 9th of Av was absolutely part of the camp's calendar, but in some idiosyncratic ways. I mean, the way that it worked is there most years was Tisha B'av, 9th of Av programming. I mean, we had a service. Then during the day, activities were a little different. And so you were aware of it. But fasting, most of the camp didn't fast. And then you could, but it was kind of an open secret that the campers somehow knew about from past years, that if you fasted, you during the meals would get to go to another building in camp and just watch movies, random animated movies or whatever kids movies. And so a lot of people literally just fasted so that they could go, you're at camp and you haven't seen a movie, and there was no oh, we're going to really go into the deep Torah of the 9th of Av. It was we're just, and in many ways that might be sort of the opposite of what people would do on that day.
Oh man.
And I remember when I was a counselor, I guess we're just reflecting on our camp counselor experiences. I then and now really valued Tisha B'av, and I wanted to make that programming more meaningful. And I had a bunch of angry kids because there were whatever, 30 or 35 kids out of our camp's couple hundred that fasted. And the majority of them did so because they had heard they were gonna get to just have like a fun day. And then I wanted to like do various exercises with them and talk about the Torah. And a few of them were like loving it. A few of them, like, they were really revved up. And others are just like, that's not why I did this. Which I'm not blaming anyone involved in that situation. It's just, it's a signal that this holiday, like, and even calling it a holiday, some people are like, no, it's not a holiday because that implies happy. It's an observance. It's hard. And you're looking to find ways to really hold grief. And in the positive ways I was saying, like to make sure grief doesn't become the whole calendar. We have a tendency as a community to absolutely ground grief. You were talking about like consumer culture in our society. I agree with you. Jewishly, we are good at talking about collective grief a lot. I don't know that we do it in an effective way, but we do it a lot, quantity-wise. We advocate for memorials to be placed in public spaces marking our tragedies year-round, and we create museums, and we do, like, there's a lot of that we do. We could unpack the different directions that's channeled. A lot of it is for Jewish nationalism. And so I don't want to go that route, but I don't know. I'm scattered because, like, there's ways that this could be a way for our collective to wrestle really healthily with, we've said trauma, we've said tragedies, like literal death and destruction, mass horrors to our people, and having a day to check in about that individually with loved ones, with friends, with community, with the world. Where can we step in to make sure it doesn't happen to others? That's so important. But the vector of the 9th of Av, the vector of Tisha B'av is so often not just about that. It's about, and therefore we have to make ourselves super safe and set up all sorts of strongholds and be nervous about all of the world's non-Jews. And that happens at a summer camp. That happens in our Jewish institutions. It happens in synagogues. It happens even in some progressive spaces. So how do we work through that?
Lex, I really appreciate you kind of bringing up this question here of what happens actually if we have a serious grief practice around Tisha B'av that is about checking in with ourselves. It's interesting, too, because I find myself sometimes at a tension about, like, with Tisha B'av, am I interested in only observing Jewish tragedies, or do I want to kind of make this other move to say, I'm actually grieving things that are happening in the world writ large and understanding my connection as a Jew to them? There are all kinds of things that we can list that are great tragedies. And is Tisha B'av just a day for all of those things, or a day that we're really trying to be specific about Jewish grief and Jewish collective mourning? It feels really important to distinguish that there are different ways to go about this. We could open up a space that is really just about the crying and the being in the grief. And then there's the part of it that's like, what if what we're doing on Tisha B'av is actually about sitting Shiva? And what happens at a Shiva at the first 7 days after someone has passed away and has been buried and the family is observing that mourning? You have people who come to the mourner's house and they comfort the mourner and they tell stories about the person who died and about the people who are connected to them. There are different observances that we do that are about the immediate aftermath of grief that's actually about comfort, such that the experience of grief can actually fully be felt. Lex, I agree with you. We do a lot of talking about grief and trauma in the Jewish community, but this question of how good of a job do we actually do? And what do we do it in service of? Do we do it in service of more paranoia or serving national interests? Or do we do it actually in service of healing and feeling more safe in the world with other people or connecting with other people? It is a question about what are we orienting this practice of Tisha B'av towards? And I think I want to actually take this as an opportunity to share a piece of Torah that I learned at first when I was visiting some friends of mine in Berlin. And it was about the fact that when we are grieving the destruction of the temple, we're not just grieving the fact that there's no longer this place, but we're grieving all of the relationships that were possible there. And Lex, you and I have talked about vows and oaths. Many of the vows and oaths that were made at that time, those oaths could only happen because you would have to go to the temple in order to break them. That there were ritual procedures that were important in place that could only exist because there was a temple. And as soon as the temple was destroyed...
to be clear, yes, some of them. Yeah, the Nazirite vow in particular is one that I think you're thinking of.
Some of the big name vows, we'll say. but that you have all of these different ways of relating to each other by making commitments to each other that could only really happen because of the structure of the temple. And when the temple gets destroyed, suddenly we're not just grieving the absence of a place, but we're grieving the atrophy of a muscle of connecting to one another through commitment. It's the rebuilding of those relationships and those connections that actually gets us to Olam Haba, to the world to come. I'm really interested in what does it mean to actually understand grief as an absolutely necessary process of functioning and like being a human and being able to acknowledge what it is to be alive and what it is to like see and witness and experience destruction and death. But also, what does it mean to orient the vector of Tisha B'av, as you said, Lex, towards something that is actually about connection rather than more destruction?
Yeah, maybe the 10th of Av, we should specifically be like immersing in outside of Jewish community spaces and connecting with others around their stories of grief and ours. I mean, maybe, like, to me, what's funny is I was implicitly criticizing the Israeli calendar and how I didn't say all this then, but like there have been a bunch of interventions where Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah, leads into then Israeli Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron, and then Yom HaAtzmaut, Independence Day, and it's creating a certain story where trauma and mourning lead to the crowning achievement of Zionism, which is not the story that I'm looking to tell with my Jewish calendrical observance and my understanding of contemporary politics. But there is thought there, that there is a progression. Like, the holidays lead into one another. And as much as I don't love what they're doing, if Tisha B'av, what's funny is the 9th of Av is not mentioned as a day anywhere in the Bible. The 7th of Av and the 10th are. So if we wanted to make the 10th of Av, and look, it's implied that 3 days of stuff is happening. So the 9th of Av, like, clearly, if the destruction happened between the 7th and 10th, it's not like making it up that the 9th would be a holiday. But there's a way in which we could have the 10th of Av be super meaningful and be about that vector, be about moving Tisha B'av into the world in healthy, effective ways where it's not just making us scared of everyone else and convinced to circle the wagons. Like, that would be really cool. I realized I didn't actually get to the reform movement history that I started talking about, and I feel bad about that because it's important, and it gets to the what is Tisha B'av question more broadly. The reform movement consciously, this wasn't like, oh, they sort of apathetically dropped this observance, it just sort of fell aside. Like, this was a conscious choice by the reform movement to not observe the 9th of Av. And I want to start talking about it by saying, in complimentary terms, that it is an example, in my view, of many ways in which the early reformers, in especially the late 1800s of the United States and then the 1900s, were unbelievably thoughtful about the calendar year, about various forms of ritual. And they made a lot of choices that were polarizing. They discarded a lot of things from tradition. They made new things in tradition. There were a lot of hot take artists. And look, we do that. Judaism Unbound does that. Like, I find that there's this tendency to really shit on the early reformers. Oh, they stopped wearing yarmulkes. They just assimilated. I don't think they were just assimilating. There's elements of that were assimilatory for sure. They understood the 9th of Av as meaning a certain set of things. There were these temples. There were a bunch of sacrifices happening there. Many things that needed to be centralized in Jerusalem. The temple was destroyed. Rabbinic Judaism gets rolling somewhat later. And there's a question to be asked. Should we mourn the destruction of those temples? What were the destructions of those temples? You gave a beautiful set of words that I co-sign, and it's why I observe the holiday. That is, the essence of the temple is not a bunch of animal sacrifices and antiquated ritual. I think the essence of the temple was a beautiful set of communal pilgrimages, a beautiful way of connecting to one another in sensory ways, deep rituals that mattered to people, not just elite Jews, but, Jews in the proverbial pews of a couple thousand years ago. If you look at the temple and you say the essence of it is a bunch of animal slaughter that is meant to connect to God, that we think is not an ideal way of connecting to God. We're grateful that prayer replaced it. We're grateful that we're not doing that anymore. If the temple were still there, maybe we'd still be there. There is a question to be asked about whether that day was traumatic or harmful or bad, or whether it might be less so. I find it horrifying to frame it that way, but I want to not strawman it. Like, I find it horrifying because there were like real, actual people. It's not like we do this thing with history where we talk about it as like, the temple, this abstraction, this idea, this way of doing things was destroyed. And we have a new way. And our new way is good. We like Rabbinic Judaism. Reform is a descendant of Rabbinic Judaism. Like, great. Without the destruction of the temples, we couldn't exist. I've heard Reform rabbis to this day who don't observe the 9th of Av and who advocate it as either a day of celebration or a non-observance. I've heard them say this, like, we needed this to get to us. I find it so offensive. But like, there is a question to be asked about whether this holiday boils down to there were these temples there that had a bunch of bad rituals happening. I'm a vegetarian. I don't want animal slaughter coming back. Or if it's about a different set of things that would be calls to us to observe today as progressive people, as maybe reform-minded people. And that's why it's actually a debate in the reform movement today, whether those summer camps you went to should be more embracing it or not.
I mean, the logic also here of we shouldn't... Or it was a good thing, in fact, actually, that the temple was destroyed and we had to go into exile and we were displaced because then we couldn't have gotten here today. I mean, it is actually the same logic as Yom HaShoah leading into Yom HaAtzmaut. I also feel horrified by silver linings, things that were massive displacements and tragedies for people. And it feels like a really, really weird way to do retrojection. But that being said, when I look at that, it's like, okay, we are Judaism Unbound. And we are, in fact, actually interested in what it means to make these radical moves in service of actually trying to serve a Judaism that feels contemporary and spiritually alive. And so I'm not interested in silver linings, horrible historical events. I am very interested, Lex, in what you said. What does it mean to actually look at the season of the existing calendar that we have of Av as being a time at the heat of the summer? Maybe Tisha B'av is actually the beginning of a different progression of grief. I'm really into this idea of Tisha B'av is about us turning inwards to our community to talk about that communal grief. And the 10th of Av is about what do we do when we come out of that grief and we actually use that grief to connect with the other griefs and destructions that are happening now. And then interestingly, we have Tu B'av, like not so far later, which is a celebration of love and connection. I mean, it's like often called Jewish.
Which is the 15th, just that's what the 2 means.
Like, it's the celebration of Jewish, essentially like Jewish Valentine's Day is some of the misnomers that, you know, we often map between calendars. What does it mean to understand Tisha B'av as the beginning of a season that is about going from grief to a place of connection? In some of the observances of the calendar, we also understand Tisha B'av as being the beginning of the high holiday season. That it actually, we start the lead up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur starting with Tisha B'av. I'm interested in thinking about how we can build out Tisha B'av to serve an agenda that is not about silver linings for terrible things, but is actually about connecting and understanding that grief is a muscle that we have to learn how to flex. And that, like, in my experience as a camp counselor, also like wishing that we taught children to experience that in more meaningful ways. And like, I hope those couple campers who were really into what you were doing, Lex, like actually took something like that. Maybe that might have influenced something that they had for the rest of their lives of believing that there was a space for grief in their life.
Yeah. Well, first off, I do think it matters that we've mentioned camp so much. It might feel weird to folks. Like, they're talking about summer camp a lot. Like the 9th of Av, and we've talked about this with Sandy Fox in the past and with others, it was made into a really big deal at Jewish summer camps for a variety of reasons. One being that it's, in certain senses, I mean, you just argued against this with the 15th of Av, with Tu B'av, but in certain senses, it's the only major calendrical observance that always or almost always falls in the summer camp season. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think there is this desire with young children specifically to have a moment to really do the collective grief thing. Every year at my summer camp, and I became a staff member, so I saw this, like we would have a staff meeting beforehand and they'd say to us, a bunch of kids in your cabin, or at least there's a chance, are going to be bawling, they're going to be traumatized, and they're going to be crying at the end of the 9th of Av. The one thing I didn't say before is there was like usually an evening program that involved like counselors reading out a litany of the world's worst tragedies for Jews, including the Holocaust, in like a dark room with candles. It was like very scary and arguably not age appropriate for everyone that was in the room. And it was meant to be like there was advanced knowledge that it was going to have a really intense impact. and there were pedagogical choices made that it's worth it. Now, I'm not here to say that every intense reaction in an educational space is bad. I don't want it to sound like I'm just saying that's inherently like a terrible educational choice. I do think there were things to questions about it, and I think it points to the ways in which this holiday is being mobilized to achieve a certain set of goals around having people feel that trauma so that they then act Jewishly in certain ways. So that's number one. The other piece, I want to be really clear. Like, you and I are both making arguments for endorsing the observance of the 9th of Av and then like understanding it in certain ways. Maybe adding on something with the 10th, like whatever we might do. It's okay to make the argument, scrap this holiday. Now, I want the reasons for it to be good reasons, but I'm feeling in me a little nervousness because I think so far in the conversation, people could listen and the takeaway could be like, well, we shouldn't just react to problematic parts of our holidays with like, ditch it. We should always reclaim, we should always revision. Sometimes. But like, there are actually red lines, and if your read on the impact the 9th of Av is having and the ways we're observing it, and even the potential ways we might observe it a little better, if your analysis is that that still doesn't make it a salvageable day, then write the piece, create the art, do the thing that says we shouldn't do this and that we should do something else, or that we should just make a cut without an ad. That's okay. I don't think it's my choice here, but there are other holidays where that's my choice. And so I don't want to set up a rubric where we sound like there's always a way to do the holiday that will feel more aligned. And so I'm curious your reaction to that. And later, I'll just plant the seed. I want to talk about some of the do's of Tisha B'av and not just the don'ts. Like not the not eating, not the things we abstain from. But what do you think about that excision, reclamation, meta conversation?
I think it's important to always have the option to just say no. It's like we can't actually claim something unless we understand that it is truly a choice. And, you know, in a sort of postmodern Rav Shagar sense of Judaism, there's this idea that it's like, if everything is a choice, then it means that when we do choose to do something, it's that much more meaningful. And I think it is, in fact, good to always consider that maybe I just won't do this. That for somebody actually maybe has grown up observing something the same way every year, I actually think there's great value to deciding that one year you are fully not going to do it or you are going to do the opposite. Because that's like really a good way to like real live test what is the thing that you actually find of value to this. And like familiarity and muscle memory can be one of those things, but ideally there should be more that's getting you to where you need to go. And so the question of like, should we always keep things? It's like you should. I think Jewishly, we actually always have to keep the idea on the table that we could just not do it. There's an interesting like epistemological question about things like Shabbat, right? I believe Shabbat happens regardless if we do it or not. And does that mean that everyone should do Shabbat? Like, I don't know. I think everybody's on their own journey about it. And like, for some people, actually not doing Shabbat is going to be like an important part of like their spiritual journey or their self-realization. So like in this way, Lex, I would say absolutely. Keeping the option open to always say no is what actually allows us to full-heartedly say yes if we do choose to say yes. So like that's one. And then I think the other question is if in fact, you know, for the listeners out there who are like, I do actually want to say yes to Tisha B'av, this question here about, right, what pedagogical choices about observance are being made is a really, really good question. And I see so much these days, and that was very much a part of my upbringing too, is that how do we get people to feel sad on Tisha B'av? We re-traumatize them. We bring them through an active traumatic experience, as though children are also not experiencing enough trauma in their own lives, just being a part of the world. We contrive of these traumatic experiences to try to force people into a space that they are having their grief activated. And then, of course, because it's run by like 19, 20, and 21-year-olds who are not trained in therapeutic or like pastoral care, there's no mechanism to actually meaningfully, psychologically, or emotionally support these children who have just been activated into a grief experience. But then we also experience that on like a synagogue or institutional level where you have adults who are like trying to get themselves into states of grief for the sake of believing that the only way that we could possibly experience the truth or the real grief of Tisha B'av is to try to make ourselves upset. Instead of just like, what does it mean to actually open up a space where the things that are already active and live for us are able to just be present? What does it mean to gather together on the floor and read Eicha or the Book of Lamentations, and to also have that be a place where the natural griefs that we're all dealing with can really emerge? The grief of day-to-day scrolling on social media and seeing the worst, most horrible things you've ever seen every single day, and then the whiplash of that being next to like a cat video. And we are complicit in some of those systems. We are the recipient of some of those damages. We are both the oppressor and the oppressed at all times. Tisha B'av should be a chance that we can have those things naturally emerge, rather than feeling like we need to contrive of these re-traumatizing experiences. So that's what I'll say on that piece of it before we move into now. And we talked about the lo tases, the things that we don't do, or like now we've talked about the things that we don't like doing or we think are bad. Like what are the tases? Like what are the things that we actually do as a part of this practice that now we can get constructive about it?
Yeah, I mean, I want to start this with an example from my own life that was to some degree inspired by my Jewish practice, but not directly a Jewish thing. Like 10-ish years ago or close to it, I started discerning, do I think watching professional football, the NFL, is something I can continue to do in my life and not feel a huge amount of moral problems based on a variety of factors? And when I was only in the lo tase, when I was only in the not watching the NFL, it was really hard for me to make an argument that I should do this. Like, there are people in my life that I love who most of my conversations with them had been around the Green Bay Packers that I grew up with and that were such an important part of my childhood and my life. Independent of like what they were doing, it was a way that communities I cared about connected to each other. And so I really wanted to defend it. And then I started thinking about, well, could I actually make a list of the people in my life that I care about, where that's some of our core threads, and think about what else connects us and what I might send them a no reason text about every once in a while. And I also thought about personally, I will lose a huge part of my weekly life. I watch the NFL on Sundays at this point. There's another football in the world that more of the world cares about. As it turned out, I became a really much bigger fan of the other football, quote unquote, like soccer. And, you know, I'm 10 years in, and I think I'm just now at a stage where I no longer miss watching the NFL very much. I watched just the Super Bowl. That's sort of the lo tase leading to the tase. Like the not watching football, the moral analysis leading to connecting to a sport that I care about a lot. And also, by the way, soccer, it's not just that it's soccer, that's like a sort of internationalism. It's connecting to a diasporic sport that people all around the world care about. And it allows me as an American who could be really grounded in just my own country's stuff, like most Americans are, to be more connected to the rest of the world. So that's an example. On the dues, on the Tisha B'av side, the Book of Lamentations, I really think we don't talk about enough. We did not read it at my summer camp. Like all this stuff, we had all this creative programming for the 9th of Av about like feeling the grief and building a sandcastle and then the counselors destroy it because we're simulating the destruction of the temple, or that like candlelit thing with a litany of the Spanish Inquisition and pogroms and Holocaust and temple destructions, not in that order. But like, we did not have programming about the book Lamentations from the Bible that is an unbelievable, vivid depiction of destruction and grief. And look, I'm not saying we should have read it from start to finish at a summer camp. Like, there are creative ways to do programming and also pick excerpts that, again, are not super age inappropriate. But I think when you read that book, it's very hard to argue, well, the destruction of the temple was just about destroying sacrifice, and now we have the diaspora, and isn't that great? Like, no, literal, like, babies are dying in this book. And every structure of society that an entire group of people cared about is being decimated. So if we read that book, I think a lot of the rest can follow, and we can start to build a 9th of Av and a calendar that is more about what we do in the world and not what we don't.
You know, I'm also thinking about experiences that I've had of Tisha B'av, specifically around sitting in the low place. That when fire was set to the temple, that until the afternoon, when the flames have gone out and now it's just kind of the smoldering ashes, you're not supposed to sit on furniture, essentially. That's like the height of normal chairs, that you sit on the floor. And it's like a little bit silly, but it also like it's strange and the lights are off. You know, that sometimes people are reading Eicha or reading Lamentations by flashlights. There's something that's actually really visually distinct. I really appreciate the fact that there's this idea that we're trying to differentiate how we even move our bodies in the space of grief. A different Tisha B'av where I was in this huge gymnasium and we read Lamentations, and in between chapters, people spoke about the griefs that were most live for them. And there was a lot of real crying, and crying that wasn't just about trying to stir up a sort of re-traumatized past, but actually being really, really present with the kind of pain that people were holding. And there was not an experience at other times in that year that I had that paralleled that. There's like a real positive sense of the experience of grief, of being able to connect in a circle with other people and saying, this is the activity and this is the focus. And we're not trying to make each other feel better about it. We're just trying to be present in that experience. And what would it be like to have camp counselors who knew how to do that? What would it be like to be a camper who receives that experience? What would it be like to be a Jew who did not grow up attending summer camp and in fact knows that there is still a communal space where you can sit on the floor with a bunch of other Jews on the 9th of Av and have that grief be really received? And then to think about more ta'ases, like more building outwards, that it doesn't actually just stop at 9th of Av. What does it mean to extend that out to the rest of the calendar?
Yeah, I think that's a really great way for us to close. We like taking micro examples of individual holidays and using them as chances to talk about the whole calendar year. I really think a healthy conversation about the 9th of Av is not only about the 9th of Av. It's part of an ecology of 365 and a quarter days that we have to make meaning from, Jewishly and otherwise. What is it achieving right now? What of that do we want to magnify and amplify? What is it not? What are our strategies? What I'd call all of our listeners to be doing is really think systematically about that. Rena Yehuda, in your amazing Shavuot Live session that we'll put in the show notes, you really encouraged us to zoom out to the whole flow of the year. And in this conversation, we've been talking about Tisha B'av and how it relates to what follows. Tisha B'av, leading into Elul, the month that leads into Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, which leads into Yom Kippur. Like, that's one side. We've also talked, I think, a little more implicitly about how the 3 weeks before the 9th of Av are their own kind of energy. I always push because I think most Jews today aren't really doing all of those intermediate times. And so it feels disingenuous to say, like, as a descriptive point, we as a people, we are in the 3 weeks leading to the 9th of Av, and so there's this collective energy. I think for some people, but what there is potential. Like, we have some seed meanings to different times of year and different days in the year. And like I said before, we can also say, well, these are wrong and they need to be changed. When we did our episode about Shavuot, we talked about how the basic fabric of what it means has been upended multiple times. And somebody decided, well, we're going to make this about the giving of the Torah of Mount Sinai when there was no reason to do that from biblical evidence or otherwise. They clearly looked, and either they said the calendar is missing this, so let's do it, or they felt like it would be worth celebrating the Torah and this would be a good day to do so. I don't know the process, but I think we should be embarking on one. Whether you're really ready to send us an email with, no, Lex and Rena Yehuda, we should be abolishing the 9th of Av, and here's my reasons why, or you are, wow, I think the 9th of Av is amazing, and even the ways you're criticizing it, I want to push back on and say that we should keep those. Like, all of those should be active processes that we're immersed in individually and that we do together, because that's the beauty of this whole shtick of Judaism, is that we have agency to be the ones to ditch a holiday in one era and see how that goes, to be the ones to make a new one, to be the ones to revision one. And so my hope is that whatever your tases and lo tases, your do's and don'ts of the 9th of Av, that each one of us brings that to the table, because we haven't nailed it yet.
I think as a closer, I'll tell a story about one of the most recent Tisha B'av observances that I had. while I was living far away from other Jews in a smaller town, and I didn't really have a synagogue to go to. And I remember I called a friend of mine who is somebody who has the ability to lane, who has the ability to read Torah. And we stayed up, lit a candle, and she laned Eicha. She laned Lamentations for me over the phone. And it was just the two of us on that phone call. And to be sitting there with a dear, dear friend late into the night, and to really actually be able to linger, to be able to actually be with somebody who I felt comfortable enough that I could start to cry. I really wish everybody to have a live enough experience of the holiday that involves real intimacy and involves real grief. If Tisha B'av is something that you want to be on your calendar and you believe that it does have potential, I really believe that there are ways that it can be connective rather than reifying the destruction of the temple that we're trying to commemorate. And so I think I challenge all unbound Jews to think about what is the ways that in grieving the destruction of the temple, we're not actually recreating more destruction, but actually allowing a container for the holiday to do the thing that it says it's supposed to do.
That's going to be our closing note. Wow. Now, as much as ever, please be in touch with us. We want to hear what landed from this conversation for you, what pushback you have, what visions you have for the 9th of Av or the calendar. And so there are a ton of ways for you to be in touch with us. I'll say them in a second, but another reminder that we have our graduation ceremony for the certificate program in Unbound Judaism that's coming up on August 2nd, 1 p.m. Eastern. And again, judaismunbound.com/certificate is where you can sign up. And in terms of being in touch with us, Facebook and Instagram, our handles are at Judaism Unbound. You can email us at hosts, HOSTS, at judaismunbound.com. That'll go to both Rena Yehuda and me. And you can head to our website, judaismunbound.com, to find show notes for this episode, other podcasts in our family of podcasts, and so many other juicy goodies. And we are super appreciative if you are interested in supporting us financially, which you can do on either a monthly recurring basis or via a one-time gift at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you all so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.